Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships and healing from them and all the things that come up, including the good old topic we come back to all the time, which is forgiveness. And I'm going to put a question to you, and I want you to take a minute and drop in the chat what you think about, and then I'm going to take it on as it specifically applies to narcissistic relationship. But it's the idea of, is not forgiving someone actually just you holding a grudge? Take that on in the comments, and let's take this on. So let's face it, forgiveness may be one of the thorniest topics that comes up when we're discussing people's experience of healing from narcissistic relationships. Now, the prevailing wisdom in the world at large and in the world of mental health is that forgiveness is good. And if you don't forgive, you're doing things like drinking poison and not moving on. But we know that's not fully true. Don't get me wrong. I know that forgiveness can have benefits, not in these relationships, not in narcissistic relationships, because repeatedly forgiving someone who repeatedly keeps betraying your trust or doing harm to you actually results in harm to you to keep forgiving. Now, many survivors feel pressure to forgive, and so they would forgive, and they would actually say that, I forgave, but this doesn't feel good. In fact, there's something kind of disjointed inside of me. And that people who forgive truly would say that forgiveness might have been even more uncomfortable. In essence, people were trying to heal from these relationships while they carried this incongruous feeling within themselves. They did what they were told was the right thing to do, to forgive, and that forgiving was meant to liberate them, but they would forgive someone in a narcissistic relationship and feel worse. Now, this video is specifically inspired by an article I read today. The article was about a person who had engaged in inappropriate behavior during their career, and especially towards women he had worked with. And he had gone on to a fair amount of fame and success. This harassment had happened, and when it came to be found out, it hurt his career. The writer of the article knew him. The man who had done this, he died young, like he was in his 50s. And the writer who knew him shared her sadness. He left behind a family. And she recognized that the world never quite forgave him, despite him working in the last many years to take ownership and attempt to make amends. That's what the article was about. The article wasn't nearly as interesting as the comments. The comments was where the eye-opening and frankly eye-watering stuff took place for me. I spent a while. I went down the rabbit hole. There were hundreds of comments. And after I read the comments, it became clear to me 1,000% again why people struggle so much with forgiveness, and more importantly, with not forgiving. And these comments were not referencing the guy in the article. Actually, very few were focused on him. It was actually a much more complicated conversation. The article and all that was a complicated conversation because he was a public figure. But the people in the comments, they were mad at anyone for not forgiving. And the theme that was coming up is that if someone doesn't forgive, that they're holding a grudge. That one stopped me square in my tracks. I'm like, not so sure about it. I found it interesting that people were being that simplistic and that reductive. Holding a grudge is holding a grudge. Listen, I'm the first one to say this as a grudge holder from way back. Holding a grudge is different. It's not letting go of, when you hold a grudge, you don't let go of maybe one or two instances. Like, you borrowed money from me and it took you 20 years to pay me back and I'm still mad about it. That's holding a grudge. Or someone saying, you flirted with my high school prom date and then you hooked up with him and now it is 15, 20, 10, however many years later, and I know we've all moved on, but I'm not going to come to your wedding. That could be a grudge. A grudge is more circumscribed. It's a bit more vindictive. And a grudge often shows up as a bit of acting out on our part, maybe not showing up to something, passive-aggressive digs. And it tends to have a clear origin. Something was done, something was said, and you're unresolved, and you want that person you hold a grudge against to know it. Okay? That's a grudge. Now, what's even more interesting when you mix forgiveness and this whole grudge thing is that you can say you forgive someone, but you may still hold a grudge. So that would look like the person paid you back the money, but you still say, hey, with interest, you should have paid me back X amount more, but I forgive you. Or you forgive the prom date friend and you say, hey, I'm good. I didn't even like my prom date, but I'm still pissed and I'm not showing up to your stupid wedding, right? So sure, a person can ostensibly forgive, but still feel that the original infraction, whatever it was, needs to be punished in some way. That is a grudge. Not forgiving someone is not the same as holding a grudge. When you put it that way, it takes a rather deep psychological process and turns it into something petty. Because I'm the first one to say a grudge is petty, right? Especially if the person that you're grudgy about did something, the time has passed, you aren't suffering any more long-term consequences, whether they paid you back, nobody cares about what happened to the damn prom date, things worked out for you. But see, you got to remember that equating the far more painful and often far more far-reaching process of not being able to forgive someone for repeated betrayals or for emotional or other forms of abuse. Someone you may have also forgiven many, many times in the past, but who would keep reharming you. And you feel more and more foolish for forgiving someone who keeps harming you. And then they also turn around and blame you. And then, of course, you blame yourself. After all that for many years, one day you might say, I don't forgive this. And you don't. And you may even feel more whole in yourself that you are not signing off on someone harming you. That is usually what not forgiving looks like. And that, my friends, is not holding a grudge. But this kind of languaging that kept coming up in this comment section, right? That court of public opinion, holding a grudge, or that you can't let go of your anger or move forward. All those things are not forgiving. That's all designed to shame people who say once and for all, no more. I do not forgive behavior that has harmed my life in so many ways. Now, interestingly, another thing that this particular article and the comments focused on is that the abuser or the harmer or whatever, the person who did the bad thing, does a bad thing and is not forgiven, and then that poor abuser just has to suffer. I was like, are you joking? This languaging around the abuser having to suffer as they wait for your forgiveness, and somehow that the person who was hurt is somehow getting off on the pain or the suffering of the offender or the abuser, call them whatever the hell you want, until they forgive. Well, that's a whole nother dynamic. Perhaps in a tiny number of cases that's happening, that people are getting off on someone's suffering until you forgive them. But that is not the norm. And the narcissistic person in these situations is probably not suffering. They may be angry because they feel entitled to your apology or your forgiveness, but suffering, not so much. But I promise you, they tell you that they are. I have to wonder if the conventional rules, turn the other cheek, forgive and forget, were just rules written a long time ago by folks who just wanted a get-out-of-jail-free card to keep hurting other people and were looking for an out. The new twist on the rules is to find ways to shame someone who recognizes that it isn't psychologically safe within themselves to forgive someone who's been harmed over and over again by someone else, right? Because one thing that also doesn't work with narcissistic folks, it's an interesting phenomenon I've talked about before. Let's say that you tell them that you forgive them. Say, I forgive you, but that you still want out of the relationship. You still want to go no contact. Then they'll say to you, well, then you don't really forgive me. Because if you forgave me, it would all go back to the way it was. But narcissistic people really do view forgiveness as a reset button. But I have to say, it was pretty ghastly to read all the imperious commenters all weighing in as this big invalidating judge and jury on the folks who can no longer, they were weighing in on people who could no longer forgive certain transgressions that happened repeatedly, that broke their trust in the world, that are simply unforgivable. But by using this demeaning language like holding a grudge, or my other favorite that I was seeing, that a person who doesn't forgive thinks that they're better than other people, that everyone makes mistakes. So if you don't forgive, then that you're not acknowledging that not everyone's perfect and you're not perfect either. And that's another thing that people endure in these relationships, right? So after I read this article and the comments, I was left feeling that it's no wonder that so many survivors of the chronic betrayals and harms of narcissistic relationships ultimately feel pressure to forgive, and they give in to that pressure. And in fact, may believe that they have no other option. Because this isn't just about forgiveness. It's also about living with the judgments and the shaming by others who are accusing you of being cold or judgmental or holier than thou or holding a grudge. It's one thing to not forgive the narcissist. It's quite another to feel that the world thinks you are a monster for not doing so. And it can definitely reinvigorate that sense of self-blame and that you are the problem once again for being a terrible, cold, and unforgiving person. This conversation will never get easier. I can see that. And the enablers and the apologists, like those in that comment section, will always judge you for not forgiving. Forgiveness is a deeply personal decision, and it is not essential to heal. In many cases, it may even make it easier if you don't, at least not right away. But ultimately, it is your call, and we need to break out of these cycles of treating non-forgiveness after a person has endured a lifetime or many years of abuse as petty, because it's anything but. And here's one last word of advice. Never read the comment section. I forgive myself. Thanks again.